Today I thought I'd do a quick video to show you a new feature in Wish 2022.03 being released on May 11th, 2022. This feature is specifically for transition houses in British Columbia, and it is something that came about a couple of weeks ago. I was informed of a new spreadsheet that transition houses in British Columbia were required to submit along with their regular statistics to BC Housing. I was sent a copy of a sample template that looked like this, and on this template there are four tabs, or four spreadsheets rather. You'll see them at the bottom. There's a stays to existing transition house, there's an instructions tab, a nightly stats tab, and another instructions. For the sake of this demonstration, of course, we're not going to rely on or reproduce these instruction tabs. Rather, we're just going to concentrate on these two tabs here, stays of existing transition house and nightly stats. I found that this spreadsheet may simply be designed for people who do not have a computerized system like Wish, in which you would manually fill these out on a transaction per transaction basis for this tab and on a day-by-day basis for this tab. So to some degree I found it a little bit annoying that whereas your stats that you report pretty much include the same information but in a cumulative form, which is the more appropriate way to request for statistics. But nonetheless, if you're being asked to fill it out, it's just an extra task that you need to do. In the essence of expediency, I wanted to see how much of this I could provide for you automatically within Wish. It does come with some challenges, however, but we've gotten to a point where we can provide this information automatically now from Wish for you. Whether or not it actually produces a spreadsheet or not seems to be a question. This template that I was provided does not really seem to be a functional template. I was unable to view into the actual cells themselves. I was unable to see if there's any formulas. There does not appear to be in this sample, so this is what I believe maybe this is just a dummy copy. So at the very best, what Wish can provide you now in BC is a very similar form, and potentially you could use it to copy and paste into the actual one that you submit. Also potentially, maybe you could just submit it directly. I'm not quite certain, but at least it'll save you the time of having to manually dig this information up. Anyway, okay, so back to this. We'll do this one tab at a time, or one spreadsheet at a time. The stays at existing transition house seems to be a line-by-line display of the people who have stayed in the transition house. So therefore, if you had 5 people staying in the transition house in the reported month, you would have 5 lines of these occupied. There are some columns in here, and they seem to, in a real spreadsheet, they would have a drop down where you could pick the various choices. Part of the challenge here is translating the data in Wish to match specifically the data that they have in their drop downs. So that is one of the challenges we have, and I'm going to show you how you do that. To the same token, if we move to this spreadsheet, the nightly stats, it is a somewhat similar in that they're asking transactions day by day, more or less. Most of this information, and this comes from your crisis calls, but some are not. For example, the number of women staying overnight at the transition house. It is a column-by-column approach, and so in theory, if you're reporting for the month of April, there would be expected to be 30 columns in here where it would have data. Rather than you having to add all this, I built a function into Wish to get that for you. So let me show you what that looks like now. If I'm logged into Wish and I go into Reports, and I go down to Generate Statistics Report, the normal way you're used to putting your statistics is you go in here and you pick a fiscal year, and you would pick the end of the quarter or the month that you wanted to print for. So we wanted to print for December or the end of our third quarter, we would pick that. And normally you would just leave this selected as summary by formulas, and you would print that, and that would print the statistics that you would normally report to your funders. For this additional spreadsheet, you would actually go down and leverage this option down here in the bottom called Other. And if you select that, you'll be able to drop this down, and on here you'll see that I added this additional function here, BC Housing Monthly Stay Listing. And when you select that, you can then go up here and print. So let me just really quickly print that. So this is what got generated here. And this is from our demo data, so there's not very much information. In our demo data, we have 3 people staying, and it basically populates the details that you would be asked to populate in here on that first tab page, is first spreadsheet. In addition to that, the nightly stats shows the same information, and it's accumulated in here and populates for each day. You see if I go across here. Now, some of these information are known automatically. For example, the number of women who stayed at the house. We also are able to ascertain the people who are staying. We're giving them a unique ID, a non-identifying unique ID. And we know things such as their age, Indigenous, so on and so forth, whether or not they're staying with their kids, which kids came to shelters, so on and so forth. The rest of these columns need some intervention or some help from you to tell you where to get it from. So I'm going to show you how you do that. Let me go back into Wish. So in Wish, when you've selected this BC Housing Monthly Stay Listing, and if you were connected or logged in as the administrator, you will get this Configure button. And it's only the admin who can configure this. So if I click on this Configure button, I will get this pop-up screen where you can configure how those columns go. So notice in this first column here, you get a selection between call sheets and shelter sheets. So those correspond specifically to those 2 tabs. The call sheet is the one that has the column, each column for a day to kind of summarize how the calls went. And the shelter sheet is the first one that displays, that has the listing of the people who stayed. And what happens in here is for each one of these, you need to specify how wishes to know where to get that information. So for example, in this one here, this ethno-cultural identity on the shelter sheet corresponds to this column right here that says ethno-cultural identity on the shelter sheet. I'm calling this first one the shelter sheet, nightly stats the call sheet. So if I want to populate what goes in here, I have to tell it where to get that information. And essentially, in here, if I click on that, you see I've told it to retrieve that information from the client demographic field. And when I choose that, I can pick which field that is. So that I know that's going to come from the ethnic origin field, and I save that. And it's going to come from this field here. So for example, configuration of that report, I am telling it in the ethnocultural identity, pull that information from the client's demographic field. You'll see now if I reprint that report, and under the ethnocultural identity, it's pulled that information and put it in here. The same thing is true with Indigenous identity. You'll notice that in my shelter sheet for Indigenous identity, I'm telling it to pull it from the Indigenous status field, which in a workbook is simply going to pull it from this field right here. Okay, so some of your stuff is going to come from the demographic fields that you have, and some of the stuff are going to come from the intake form. So you may recall when you do a stay, you have an intake form that needs to be filled out. I guess we just never did one in here, but for example, if I pick the primary reason for the stay, for example, is is abuse, and I save that. So this happens to be question number 3 on that form tied to the intake. And so the way that I identify those is if I go back to the configure, you'll notice under the shelter sheet, under the primary reason, if I clicked on that, I said here that it's coming from the connected shelter intake form and for question 3. So basically now when I print that, it fills out this column based on those choices. Now here's where the caveat comes in. The choices that I had set up on my demo were specifically printed A period abuse, B period homelessness. That doesn't match exactly what you see in the sample that was sent. So you may need to adjust the choices that are in your form so that they match exactly how these columns are printed. Otherwise, you may not be able to directly import that data or copy that data over. I think what my intention is here is once you have these sheets, you may be having to use it where you would have to physically copy a whole range of data and paste it into the other form that you need to submit to BC Housing. Since I wasn't privy to the exact purpose or mechanics of the form, I'm unable to produce that for you. Okay, let's talk really quickly about the nightly stats in here. Most of the stuff in the nightly stats are about turnaways. So for example, insufficient staff, resources, insufficient space, so on and so forth. And those are intended to come from your crisis call. On this particular one, our CERD field is got a code in here. And those codes basically are down here. We call them request for admission codes. That's what comes up there. And you'll see the codes that are currently set up in our demo. So we have substance use issues, mental health. So these are very, very similar to what's being asked on that spreadsheet. In our demo, this is what we have set up. And for example, I'm going to pick these particular ones, insufficient space or no space. So these are 2 here that would go together on a single line. Then I've got mental health, substance abuse, mental health. So you can see the way these go. So I'm just going to write those codes down. Minus A and B should be added together. D, E, and F can go on their own line. G goes on another one, so on and so forth. So G is language. Okay, so I won't set them all up, but for the sake of brevity. But I'm going to pop into here, and if I go into this spot here, when I'm doing the configure line, under call sheets, the turnaway for insufficient space, for example, if I want to populate that, I select that row. Now up here, I tell it where it comes from. And that's going to come from a crisis call field. And when I select that, what you're going to see is I can choose request for admission. And I'm going to choose that. And the valid codes for that one happen to be 2. So it says I separate them with a semicolon. So I'm going to minus A was a code, semicolon, minus B was another code. And I'm going to save that. Good, okay. And I'm not going to take the time to populate all of those, but that's essentially what you would do in here is populate all of these choices. What that means is when you print that report now, so you can see in here that we have some things calculating now automatically on the spreadsheet that tie in that you would then use to report to the BC Housing. Anyway, there is a little bit of setup time to be done in this function and feature. If you are confused by that or just simply want help, you can get in touch with me and I'll help you go through that and set that up specifically for your needs. Once again, the intention of this is to save you time filling that sheet out. I suppose, although I'm not entirely certain, I think that once you print that report, you will be able to potentially copy the contents to the actual template that is provided by BC Housing. I don't think you can submit it directly. If anybody has a contact at BC Housing who's going to entertain a call from us, I'd be happy to call that person. and maybe get more direction on this. But at very least, this should save you quite a bit of time in compiling that data. And once again, if you need any help, just reach out.